Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our March session of Rights at Night. I am Lisa Morgan, a kindergarten teacher and president of GAE, and we are here tonight to learn more about Senate Bill 202 that passed last year and what that is going to mean for each of us as we prepare to vote in the 2022 primary and general elections. And to walk us through that, we have our general counsel, Mike McGonigal. And Mike, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and begin. And begin talking about, go over Senate Bill 202, why it should matter to GAE. We want to talk a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of Senate Bill 202 and some of the changes that it made in election law. And it won't cover all of them. I had to make room to talk a little bit about the important dates to everybody should keep in mind coming up with respect to the 2022 elections. So with that, I want to begin with, why it should matter to GAE. And so the first slide, I don't want to read the slides off to you. You can read them, but our very own Constitution says that one of our purposes is to strengthen human and civil rights of all members. So that goes to one of our core values is civil rights, and what are voting rights and election laws. They're fundamental to our democracy. So that's one reason to care, that it's enshrined in our own Constitution. Well, in 2020, we underwent some historic changes, historic amendments with GAE that we've been living with since the merger of the two organizations back in the early 70s. And the language that the Representative Assembly adopted again goes to our commitment to diversity and inclusivity within GA's elective and appointive offices. So there again, we have a commitment to inclusivity and diversity. Another reason why we should care about election law. Well, okay, I'm having that problem. Let's see. There we go. So I know that's too many words on a screen, but again, this is not all of the amendments that we did, the GA Representative Assembly did in 2020. But again, it shows the level of commitment that GAE's own membership shows to diversity and inclusivity within our own organization. And we created a committee, a standing committee, called the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which is supposed to, their charge is written there to develop and deliver workshops, train members on matters of systemic patterns of inequity, racism, educational justice that impacts educators and students. So there again, we see that we do have, as part of our core values, going back to the merger of the association to present day, as to why we should be concerned about state of Georgia's election laws and what they mean for us. So there's a very good book that I'd recommend everybody, in your leisure time, pick up and read. It's by Professor Derek Black. He is a law professor at the University of South Carolina Law School. And he makes he kind of states the obvious, if you will. he reminds us that public education and democracy and voting rights, they live together and they die together. That public education and state voting rights, there really are one narrative. And I plucked a quote from Thomas Jefferson there that really summarizes what our commitment as a professional education organization is about. What is the purpose of public education? Well, as Jefferson noted, it's necessary to prepare citizens to participate effectively and intelligently in our open political system and to preserve freedom and independence. So with that, I mean, we kind of have to state the obvious sometimes, that public education and democracy, again, are one narrative, and they live together and they die together. That is why GAE should be interested and vocal about the changes that are have happened in Georgia in 2021. And there's a bill pending in the legislature that we'll get into that also threatens to undermine our democracy here in Georgia. So I also put the presentation about SB 202 within another context, trying to capture the different contexts here, that it represents an assault on public education, and I'll repeat myself, but if you assault democracy and voting rights, you're assaulting public education. And it fits within the trends that we've all been following since 1999, when charter schools were first introduced in Georgia, and of course our declining commitment to adequately fund public education. And then it picked up steam, the education reform movement, if you will, picked up steam in 2015 when Governor Deal required all school districts to choose a model of education, traditional charter school system, or a strategic waiver system, which really meant that hopefully everybody's aware that those models of education, except the traditional, allow the local board of education to simply not pay attention to the traffic laws, not pay attention to the stoplight and the traffic light, or can waive state education laws. That's an assault on public education. Well, in 2021, the connection really came home to me when the General Assembly voted to expand private vouchers, but at the same time voted to shrink public citizen voter education rights by adopting SB 202, the Voter Integrity Act of 2021. Okay. Lisa, you'll get that title?
Yes, I got it for her.
Okay. Well, so why it should matter to GAE, this really requires just a little bit of history. We often say, yeah, we're the merger of the two professional teacher organizations in Georgia, one white and one black. And but nobody ever really goes back to get a little bit more of the backstory. And this slide just kind of puts things in context, at least for me, and I hope it does for you. After the Civil War was fought, we had the two education organizations formed, the GEA in 1866. That was the whites only organization. They did not permit blacks or folks other than whites into their association. The GT&EA, Georgia Teachers and Educators Association, that is what's referred to as the Black Teacher Organization. And while it was predominantly black, they did accept members, white members, if they so chose, to join the GT&EA. But those were the times in which present day GA was born was out of immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And just, you kind of have to put yourself in the place of those people, of what it was like to live in those times, and the focus that they had on public education as a means for improving our general democracy. Our general democracy requires the equality of every people to be the same. And even though the organizations were segregated, they still, at the time, were trying to focus on equality of all individuals. Well, as you can see, being a lawyer, I do have to throw in a couple of Supreme Court decisions of what these organizations were under all sorts of attacks from our own U.S. Supreme Court, where Plessy versus Ferguson said it was legal to have separate organizations, separate groups in society, and they determined that that was equal. And that was accepted as the law of the land up until basically overturning in 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, which said that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And as we get into the 1950s, we get into, Jim Crow and the heated resistance that the white powers that be in Georgia that controlled public education fought tooth and nail to implement Brown versus Board of Education. And it was termed here in Georgia as a second-class integration. And that is a quote from the resource at the bottom, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, Uncovering the Hidden Heroes that fought for justice in schools. And for those who aren't aware, Horace Tate, Dr. Horace Tate, was GAE's very first African-American executive director. And the book by Professor Siddle Walker brings to life, even though it's on a page, brings to life what life was like in Georgia during Jim Crow, and what Dr. Tate and his wife, who was also a very accomplished educator, she had a PhD in education from Vanderbilt, very, very credible, what it was like to battle the resistance to Brown versus Board of Education in Georgia. And there is a section in there, a very interesting and enlightening section about the merger that occurred in 1970. And it takes you into the convention halls of the GT&EA and brings out the debates at the time that the Black organization was having whether or not to merge with the white organization. And so that I highly recommend the book, because I feel it's necessary that if you want to know about GAE, you certainly need to understand the historical context of the merger and the background to it, and how that informs present day circumstances. So why again, why SB 202 should matter to GAE? I mean, again, I have to look at it from the point of view and empathize with our African-American citizens and what that history has meant to Black individuals, Black citizens in Georgia. And as you can see, 1868, we had the 14th Amendment that ensured progress, that has an equal protection clause in it. But states were allowed to construct their own state election laws. And even though Black males had gained the right to vote in 1868, and 25 Black citizens were elected as senators to the state of Georgia General Assembly, they were expelled. As soon as they were elected, they were expelled. The General Assembly at the time said, well, you might have the right to vote, but you don't have the right to hold office. And so that is part of Georgia's history. Another part of our history is, of course, in the Jim Crow era, where we had overt racial structures limiting and prohibiting the full participation of Black Americans in their own democracy, or something like the poll tax, where you had to pay money in order to vote. And when you read the history, even if they paid the poll tax, there were plenty of threats of lynching going on, that you may have paid your poll tax, but if you come and vote, you might have to pay with your life. And there's plenty of examples where that actually occurred, if not in Georgia, certainly throughout the South. Well, I just throw in Giles v. Harrison there again. As a lawyer, it's a case that's been overlooked, but it said, looking at an Alabama state law that disenfranchised Blacks from participating in elections, the Supreme Court there looked at the state law and said that, well, those are political rights, and the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction, for the lack of a better term. And so from that point on, again, the U.S. Supreme Court has tried to stay out of interfering with state election laws. And that's just their doctrine. I mean, I certainly don't agree with it, but that is what the law says. So that is the history of our African-American GA members bring to the present. And it's important that we acknowledge that. So again, a little bit more history of what we're leading into here is the promise of racial equality with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That began to, it took an act of federal government to enact laws that prohibited discrimination across the country. And importantly for this discussion, the 65 and 68 Voting Rights Act. Those acts, the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 5, meant that states like Georgia, who were in the Confederacy, who had a history of discrimination against African-American citizens, anytime they wanted to change the state election laws, they had to send it to the federal Justice Department for pre-clearance. And that is how progress was made, was through the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 pre-clearance. And I'll just jump down to Shelby in 2013, and I'll have some more to say about that. But in 2013, the US Supreme Court just simply gutted the pre-clearance requirement. And after that, we saw many of the former Confederate states, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Texas is included in that group, Alabama certainly, began to adopt discriminatory laws designed to disenfranchise voters of color. And that is the argument that critics of Senate Bill 202 hold, that there was no, Senate Bill 202 did not have to go through a pre-clearance. If it had, it probably would not have been granted passage, certainly not in the form as signed by Governor Kemp. And we'll touch upon the Brnovich case a little bit later on. But again, that's why voting rights matter. When you attack democracy, you're attacking public education, because the purpose of public education is to produce well-informed citizens so that they can participate in their democracy. So just turning a little bit to SB 202 now, I found very interesting this quote from the one of the purposes of the state election board. And the language to me is very telling, and people can say, well, that's legacy language and doesn't have a lot of meaning, but there it is in black and white. It's to maintain the purity in all elections here in the state of Georgia. And there's just only one way, really. It's not debatable. It may make people feel uncomfortable, but is to maintain the racial purity or the ethnic purity, if you will, of elections. SB 202 seems to be dialing the clock backwards to where we do maintain the racial or ethnic purity in our election laws. And we'll get into that in a few slides coming up. So one of the main purposes of SB 202, if you read its purpose section, is very long, but it boils down to restoring voter confidence and ensuring election integrity. And of course, that is in the backdrop of all of the election challenges that went on after the 2020-2021 state elections. And there was no, as you all know, there was no fraud found, really, no rampant fraud whatsoever. And yet SB 202 says that one of its main purposes is to restore voter confidence when the confidence really wasn't shaken. We had historic turnouts is what we had, but there was no fraud found. But that is these are the purposes on paper for SB 202. So here are some of the changes, and you'll have to ask yourselves, as I go through this, I evaluate SB 202 in light of GAE's values. And the GAE values that are in our Constitution, are in our bylaws, that we have since the time of the merger to the present day, are that every person is equal. And we are for equality and open democracy and inclusivity. And so a law such as SB 202, if it doesn't align with our values, then there is something to me to be said about that law, just to be blunt about it. So the good thing about SB 202, well, it codifies drop boxes, but the funny thing about the drop boxes is that it said the drop box must be inside a polling place. Now, the whole concept of a drop box is it should be outside where I vote. It's a public library, and you can just get out of your car, walk up, put in your absentee ballot, and walk away. So it doesn't make much sense to put it inside a polling place, unless you want to, make it more difficult. And you might say, well, how much more difficult is it? Well, it really, in one sense, it really isn't. But why is it there if there was no fraud to begin with? And it must be under constant surveillance. The previous election in 2020, the drop boxes were already under constant surveillance. But now it appears that if it's inside a polling place, constant surveillance can mean a deputy sheriff there, or some security guard that's going to be standing, next to the drop box as you deposit your vote. So that can, for some people, it doesn't feel very open and free, and it doesn't feel very inclusive when you do that. So the big loser in drop boxes is Metro Atlanta, where we had probably the most historic turnout in Georgia electoral history. And you can see from this slide just where, just what happened. It's a very graphic representation of the exclusion of voter participation simply by eliminating drop boxes in the metro area. So to me, that doesn't align with GAE's values of equality, democracy, and inclusivity. So ID requirement is another voter requirement. And for someone like me, having an ID it's easy. It's easy for me to have. And I understand the rules, but they decided to make it a little more difficult when you have to have a driver's license when you're requesting an absentee ballot and you're returning it. And again, that may not seem like a big deal, someone like me, although I am prone to mistakes. I think President Morgan, she can probably attest that I'm prone to mistakes. And if I forget to put my driver's ID on the return ballot, chances are it's not going to count. And it also, at the time this was written, it had disenfranchised 3% of registered voters who lack a form of ID, which are predominantly poorer people and disproportionately people of color. So this is an example that it doesn't open up the doors to democracy. It excludes citizens from participating in their own democracy. And of course, here's the one that I think gets attention. I think the drop boxes have gotten attention, and the voter ID gets attention. And of course, this does as well. This is the line worming prohibition that criminalizes basic human necessities. And it makes a misdemeanor if you're caught handing food or water to those in line within a certain parameter of the voting place. There's a fine up to $1,000, and you can even go to jail for it. Now, what this will do is dissuade voters from actually voting. Voting. So if you don't want to wait in line, then you aren't going to have, somebody just give you a bottle of water, for example, just to make sure that people are taken care of. I looked up the PolitiFact rating on, there's another one of the false lies or big lies out there, is that SB 202 does not criminalize food or water. And PolitiFact rated that mostly false. And the reason they didn't give it a pants on fire rating is because the law says there shall be a water receptacle outside of the polling place. So there is water available, but it can only be put out there by the poll workers. But you or I can't give food or water or snacks to people in line. And that law, I think we'll talk about upcoming, but that's retroactive. And we've had a couple of state legislators already being investigated by the Georgia Attorney General's office for handing out, I think, pizza to one line, and somebody was handing out bags of potato chips in 2018, believe it or not, and he was under investigation. Well, this only pertains to Fulton County, because Fulton County was the only county in the state that actually took polling places to the voters with taking polling machines in buses and made them widely available, or more available to the voters. And of course, there was a historic turnout in Fulton County. Many people of black and brown African descent participated. 112,000 cast mobile votes in Fulton County. Well, there will no longer be able to do that. And my question is, does that align with GAE's values of equality, open democracy, and inclusivity, or not? Well, this is another new one. If you vote in the wrong precinct, typically you could still cast a provisional ballot. So if you move across town and you should have been over in this precinct, but you went to the wrong precinct, you get up to the voting table you find out you're in the wrong place, they would still let you cast a ballot called a provisional ballot. And they would check into it. And most of the time, the ballot would be a validly cast, that it would, they would, whatever the mistake was, a technical error, not a big deal, would be, they would allow the provisional ballot to be cast. And you can see 3,357 provisional ballots that counted in 2020 would not have counted. And there's a similar provision that was held legal in the Brnovich case that we'll get to in a little bit sooner, but that's a forecast of mine that says the Brnovich ruling will, if it were challenged here in Georgia, this provisional ballot provision will probably be upheld as constitutional, that the states have rights to do that. And I'll get into a little bit more of their analysis. Mass mailings of absentee ballots, they are now restricted. If you remember in the 2020 elections, because they were hotly contested, you'd go to your mailbox and you'd see all kinds of offers of absentee ballots or applications to obtain an absentee ballot in your mailbox. Well, those are illegal now. Organizations, whether they're liberal or conservative, Democrat, Republican, they can no longer send you an absentee ballot application or fill it out, send it to them, and they will mail it for you. That's now illegal. Illegal in Georgia. SB 202 open the floodgates up to unlimited voter challenges to voter eligibility. And there's actually an example of a Texas vote that challenged the Georgia voter, 360,000 registered voters, in attempts to disqualify them. But nothing ever really came of it, except that we had to go through the process and at the end of the day find out there was no fraud. Well, the legislature apparently wasn't persuaded that that was enough. Even though there was no fraud, they still opened the doors up to anybody. Me or you could pick up the phone and call the Attorney General's office and report voter fraud, and I can do so anonymously. So we're, you have to ask yourself, is that going to intimidate voters? Or is it going to unleash a lot more of unfounded allegations of voter fraud in Georgia? Well, time will tell. Time will tell. But this is one of the changes that SB 202 made. And whether you have to ask yourself whether that aligns with GA's core values of equality of all people and open democracy and inclusivity in our election process. So this is just more of the law. It's created a law enforcement hotline. And as I said, right away, someone like me, I can call up and anonymously complain about voter fraud and intimidation. And the question is going to be, is the state attorney general going to investigate all these? How are they going to screen them? Do they have the staffing to do that? How long will the investigations take? How much does all that cost? Apparently nobody's actually ever thought of that. As I mentioned earlier about the criminalization of handing out food and water to voters in line, the law is retroactive, and here is about as current as my information has. Representative Roger Bruce was handing out potato chips in 2020 to folks waiting in line, and he wore a Roger Bruce State Representative t-shirt. That was reported as violating the 2021 law criminalizing handing out food and water to voters in line. And the other one is Matthew Wilson, who was handing out pizza. And if you can believe it, he was handing out pizza in 2018. So that shows you to the extent that those who are not for inclusivity, who are not for an open democracy, who are not for about the equality of citizens, the values that GAE holds, this is the extent that some folks are going with our election laws here in Georgia. So talk just a minute about how racism survives race-neutral election laws. And so it's very, very current now with this Supreme Court beginning back in 2013, Shelby versus Holder, looked at the pre-clearance provision. If you remember, I talked about the pre-clearance provision in the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 said states like Georgia and the former Confederate states who had a history of disenfranchising Black citizens from participating in their own democracy, they had to submit election law changes to the federal U.S. Department of Justice to see if it had a racial impact and disenfranchised Black citizens' voting rights. Shelby said you don't have to do that anymore. Okay, well, that opened the doors up to Senate Bill 202, which was signed in 2021. They did not have to send it to the U.S. Department of Justice for a pre-clearance. Now, the latest development, at least from the Supreme Court standpoint, is this Brnovich case, which looked at another provision of the Voting Rights Act, and it looked at Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And it looked at, as I mentioned earlier, the out-of-precinct voting. The Arizona law that was under analysis there had a very similar provision that said if you vote out of precinct and you don't get to your regular precinct by 5 o'clock, your vote's not going to count. The U.S. Supreme Court said that is constitutional, even though it disenfranchises voters. The current Supreme Court, including Amy Coney Barrett, weighed in on this, very recent, very conservative, said that is legal, constitutional thing for a state to do. The other thing it did, which is also part of SB 202, it prohibited ballot harvesting, meaning that if you're elderly, don't have a transportation, can't get to the and office, or whatever the reason is, I cannot go to my grandmother's house and get her absentee ballot and put it in the mailbox for her, for whatever reason. That was banned in Arizona. It is banned in SB 202, and the Brnovich case said that was legal, that is constitutional, even though it will have a tendency to disproportionately disenfranchise voters of color, as was demonstrated in that case. There was ample data showing that banning ballot harvesting disproportionately impact Black citizens and Latino citizens. But the Supreme Court said, here's what they're doing. They're no longer focusing on the impact of voters. They're focusing on the state's rights, ability to write laws to regulate their elections. So that's the new era that we are in. The United States Supreme Court is not looking at how these laws really impact voters. They're looking at how, again, that phrase states' rights, you've heard of that? That was very popular in the Jim Crow era. They are looking at the state's rights and their ability to regulate elections. So that's Brnovich, Shelby and Brnovich.
Mike, we
Yep.
have 20 minutes left. This is your
20
time
minutes.
warning.
We're gonna, then we're, all right. Let me just hit this and then we'll get to the rest. I apologize. But there is a Voting Rights Act case that was decided here in Georgia, February 28th, where U.S. District Court judge here in Atlanta looked at the state and federal redistricting plans here in Georgia. And the judge said the redistricting plans in Georgia, both the state, for the state house races and the federal congressional races, he said they're unconstitutional. He said that they will dilute the voting rights of Black Americans. And in the next sentence, he said, you know what, they're illegal and unconstitutional, but you know what? We're so close to the Georgia elections that we're going to have to use these illegal maps. That is the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity versus Raffensperger. That's a consolidated case, consolidated 3 cases, and you can look it up by just simply copying that and the case number and putting it in Google, and it'll bring up that decision. But this is real. This is happening in Georgia. Well, I don't know, Lisa, there's a pending voter intimidation bill 1464 in the Georgia legislature. This will be up on our website and you can take a little bit more longer look at it. But one of the scarier things about it, it just authorizes the GBI to, it gives the GBI carte blanche authority to initiate any election or initiate election investigations of fraud that it wants to. It does not have to wait from a referral from the Secretary of State's office or the Georgia Attorney General's office. So these are the races on the slide for 2022. As you can see, everything's basically up for grabs. Senate, House, federal and state, governor, lieutenant governor, and our Secretary of State and all the rest. So again, this will be on the website, but the important dates are primary election date is Tuesday, May 24th, and the general election is Tuesday, November 8th. And if it's necessary, a general election runoff will be Tuesday, December 6th. And keep in mind, on election day, you can vote only at your precinct polling location. If you show up at the wrong location, you have to get in line by, the law says 5 o'clock, but I think polls are open till 7. If you're not in line by 7, your vote won't count. So remember, that eliminated the provisional voting system that worked well for decades here. That's taken away. So be very sure if you're voting on election day, you know exactly the precinct that you should go to. Absentee balloting, I think everybody knows what that is. It's a paper ballot. I downloaded mine the other day and I'm applying for my absentee ballot. Early voting and absentee voting, advanced voting, those are all the, excuse me, the same idea, the same terms. Well, I assume pretty much everybody on this call is registered, but if you're not, there are different ways to do so. You can go online to the Secretary of State's website, and you can download, excuse me, the form. You need a driver's license or identifications card. You can do it by mail or by phone by calling your elections office, or you can walk into the county elections office, or when you renew your driver's license. And I know somebody here at GAE who did just that. He renewed his driver's license, and he registered to vote, all in one. So voter registration, the last day to register for the primary is Monday, April 25th. The primary is May 24th, but you must register by Monday, April 25th. The deadline to register online for the November 8th general is October 11th. Got to be registered to vote for the general election by Tuesday, October 11th.
Okay, Mike, if you can go back to that for just a second.
Yep.
About the primary. One thing that we really need our members to know is that if your school board election is nonpartisan, that final election is on May 24th. So judges, some of our school boards, and we have a couple of questions, Mike, and I want to get them in real quick.
All right.
One person asked, during early voting, can they legally modify the hours? So the office hours, because that early voting is available.
For early voting, I don't know about early voting for modifying the hours for early voting. I mean, isn't that you're putting it in the mail? I mean,
No, that's when you go and vote in person during the 3 weeks early voting.
Oh, right. I'm not aware of that. I know on voting day, though, in order to extend the voting hours, you have to get a court order to extend the voting hours. But I'm not aware of extending the hours for early voting, but that's something I can look into.
Right. And I know my county had different hours at the different early voting locations.
Oh.
If you were early voting at the elections office, it was normal business hours, but the location, for example, where I voted was the fairgrounds, and it was open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So those were different. Okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead. If we get another question in the chat, I'll let you know.
Okay. Well, again, I think most people on the call are knowledgeable, but how do you get a mail-in or absentee ballot? I did mine on the My Voter page at Secretary of State. I can email it, I can fax it or email it to the county registrar. You can do it by mail or by phone in the county elections office, or you can do it in person at your county elections office. So there are multiple ways that you can get your absentee ballot. Now, here are the important deadlines to cast an absentee ballot. Well, first to request and then to submit. So for the May 24th primary, you must request the absentee ballot by Tuesday, May 7th. Write that down. And for the general on November 8th, you must request your absentee ballot by Tuesday, August 22nd. Now, to submit your absentee ballot, excuse me, for the primaries, you must submit that absentee ballot by Tuesday, May 13th, or on, I should say, by or on Tuesday, May 13th. And the last day to submit your absentee ballot for the general election is by or on Friday, October 28th. So again, how do I return an absentee ballot? Well, even though they've been severely curtailed, you should go to your My Voter page. And I think Lisa might have been alluding to early voting can have different hours. The polling places could have early different hours. You got to be very, very attentive as to where those drop boxes are. You can also mail it, but remember the deadlines of when you have to mail it. And be sure to do it at least 7 days prior to the election, just to, at whatever cost, you know, make sure that it's in, that you don't delay and procrastinate. Get your ballot in at least 7 days. That's just a practical tip. When does early voting begin? Well, okay, for the primary, it begins on Monday, May 2nd, and ends on Friday, May 20th. And again, in person, this is for in person. In person for the general begins, early voting for the general is Monday, October 17th, and ends Friday, November 4th, excuse me. So keep those dates in mind. If you like going in person and voting, there are still those opportunities to do so. Before the pandemic, that was my thing. I would be the only person early voting where I go to vote. And the pandemic changed things up for me. I vote by absentee now. So, but pay attention to the hours of where you can early vote in person in your precinct. Well, that's what I had prepared for you.
Okay. And I wanted to ask if we have any more questions. Okay, so we had someone who requested where they can request the absentee ballot. So Mike, you want to go back and review that for us?
Sure.
I thought that might happen.
Requesting, here you go. Requesting an absentee or mail-in ballot. So you have to do that by Tuesday, March 7th for the primary. And if you get it for the primary, if I'm not mistaken, you can check off primary and general on the application. But in order to vote in the primary, you have to request your absentee ballot by Tuesday, March 7th. And say you don't vote in the primary, but you want to vote in the general, well, you have to request that absentee ballot by Tuesday, August 22nd.
Okay, that's when we can start. Right.
What you mean?
That's the first day we can request.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, the earliest day to request. If I wasn't clear, right.
Yeah.
The earliest day to request it is Tuesday, March 7th for the May 24th primary. But as I say, when I got my absentee ballot the other day, it asked me, am I requesting it for the primary and the general? So I can check off both boxes, kill two birds with one stone. So.
Okay. One thing I want to point out, because I printed one of the absentee ballots.
Okay.
And I think this is a intimidation tactic. Because it says on here, giving false information on this application violates Georgia law and is punishable by a fine up to $100,000, imprisonment for up to 10 years, or both. Always what I want to hear when I read this. Okay, so Mike, if you want to go back to that House bill,
yes,
1584.
Yes.
I'll put in a little bit of legislative update. This bill did pass the House, and as you can imagine, it was a straight party vote.
Mm-hmm.
It will be in the Senate, and we need everybody to pay attention to your legislative alerts. There are 6 legislative days left. And as of now, the House has not taken up a single Senate bill, and the Senate has taken up one House bill. So HB 1464 has not yet been heard in the Senate committee, but it will be in our legislative alerts when it is there and available. So I want everybody to understand I did a little bit of simple math for the third provision about reducing the number of voting machines.
Mm-hmm.
And I guesstimate that it takes about 5 minutes to vote by the time you put the card in the machine, scroll all the way through and select everything you want to vote, and then have it print on the printer. So that means 12 people can vote in an hour, and there's 12 hours that the machines are there. So that means 144 people could vote on one machine if you were voting continuously, one right after the other all day long. So how do we expect that one machine for every 250 people who haven't voted is going to work?
Right.
Unless you're thinking that everybody who hasn't voted already is going to then show up and see there's a long line and get out of line and not vote. So we will be giving that to you. We will be keeping you up to date on that. And I know this was Rights at Night about voting, but Mike, I need to give a quick legislative update for something that just went out to our members. House Bill 1295 is a bill dealing with teacher keys and eliminating the adverse action when an educator gets needs development. If you do not know, currently a teacher that gets needs development on their teacher keys, if that happens twice in 5 years, they are unable to renew their certificate. And if it happens twice, they those years do not count toward their placement on the salary schedule. So HB 1295 would eliminate those adverse actions. You could still get a needs development, but it would not impact your certificate or your salary. The bill passed the House overwhelmingly. It was brought up yesterday, in the Senate Education Committee, and the sponsor of the bill found out 5 minutes before the committee meeting started that the Professional Standards Commission had talked to a senator and asked them to amend the bill and make it only apply to a teacher's first 3 years. So in your first 3 years, you could get needs development and it would not adversely impact you. But after 3 years, should you get needs development, it would adversely impact your certificate. Okay, so the original HB 1295 is good for educators. The proposed amendment is not. So I am putting in the chat right now, and this one is easy to remember, tinyurl.com/saveteaks. We need you to click on that link and send an email to the Senate Education Committee members tonight and ask them to support the original House Bill 1295 and vote no on the amendment. It will be back up in that committee tomorrow afternoon at 2. And we will be at the Capitol all day working on this to try to keep this alive as a good bill for all our members. If you follow the GAE President's Facebook page, I've already posted it there. You can share from there. Please share. Please text your friends, any educator you know, and ask them to come here and send their emails. And the other thing I will be putting up later this evening is we will have another legislative contact team work session next Wednesday. At that point, we will have two legislative days left. So we will really know where we are and what we need to be writing our legislators about for the end of the session. And Mike, I want to thank you very much for this. It was very informative, and I know we kind of rushed you through part of it,
It's okay.
but truly appreciate it. And for those of you who are here, we will have the recording up, and I will email it to all of you who are here Thursday. and those people who registered, so they will have the benefit of the recording to see it. And thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you for all you do for our students. Thank you for being a member of GAE, and you all have a great evening.